Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Michael Cover with Dave. I'm the co-moderator of the Mediators New Breakfast Club. So welcome to this session. Our guest is Brian Clark, and he's on. So Brian, perhaps you'd like to briefly introduce yourself, and then we'll get going.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael. It's lovely to be here today and to meet you all. I know some of you I've met a few times before, and some of you I haven't met yet, but lovely to see all of you, and thanks for coming on the call today. So I'm a professor at Newcastle University, and I do quite a lot of teaching and training and research in the area of mediation and dispute resolution. I'm a commercial lawyer by background. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of linked things today. And one is some research that I conducted with one of my colleagues, Professor Tanya Sourdin, who's in the other Newcastle in Australia. There's no connection, but just happens to be the same name. And it was an interview study of some international commercial mediators. And we talked to them about a range of things, but one thing we did talk to them about was their experiences with online mediation, so mediating over Zoom or other similar platforms. I'll talk about that today. And a little bit about my experiences in training and teaching mediation online and what that means for practice, and just to open that up for discussion with all of you here. And I'm really interested to hear your own views as practitioners in the field, how online has shifted things for you and what that's meant for your practice. So I do have some slides to share here. I'm just going to share the screen now, and hopefully you can see that now. So, okay, got that there. So I'm just going to go to the slideshow. I go from beginning.
Could I ask, will the slides be made available later or not?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll send them on to Dave and Michael and for dissemination. That's absolutely no problem at all. So as you can see, I'm just going to talk about a couple of things, which is mediation practice and education in the online sphere. And this is kind of a summary for you of what I'm going to talk about today. And so I'm interested in this shift, this quite significant fundamental shift to online mediation. And we were just discussing this morning how the Breakfast Club used to be an in-person meeting in London, and after COVID, it became an online phenomenon, which is the same for so many different things in our lives. And what I'm going to talk principally about is this research I conducted with my colleague Tanya Sourdin into the experiences of international commercial mediators with online mediation. I also want to say a little bit about online mediation education developments, because that's been another quite fundamental shift in mediation training. So much of it now takes place online. And a few things about my own experiences in running the program. We've got an online master's program in mediation and international dispute resolution here at Newcastle, and what I've gleaned from that experience as well. So just a couple of background issues about online mediation. So clearly the COVID-related lockdowns dramatically accelerated the use of mediating online. Of course, developments predate that time, and I'm sure some of you were already at that stage engaged in online mediation to one degree or another. But of course, it rapidly accelerated out of necessity, this shift to online engagement in lots of different areas, including mediation, including court hearings, arbitration, meetings, all different activities that have migrated online. There's been a long-standing debate, actually, about the extent to which online mediation is a positive development, and discussion of its merits and also its deficiencies, as opposed to mediating in the flesh, as it were, in person. And obviously, for much time, there's been discussion about some of the benefits. There are clearly potentially significant benefits in terms of the costs involved, time efficiencies, the fact you've got greater immediacy, that things can happen much more quickly. There are obviously carbon footprint savings. I'll say a bit more about that later on. But there was obviously quite a number of negatives as well talked about with regard to mediating online. Such a sophisticated, interactive, personal process. Can we replicate the nuances of that on a screen? That was one of the big questions. Can you capture the nuances of in-person mediation? Things such as Zoom fatigue, difficulty being on a screen for a long time, and issues around confidentiality and security, which are different, of course, in the online arena. And just this is a quote from Ebner, who's one of the sort of key authors in the field, and he's been involved for many years promoting online mediation. And this is a quote from one of his books here. And he said, well, online dispute resolution will never work. So I've been told a million times, why not? These processes are built on a foundation of interpersonal dynamics, impossible to replicate online. The back and forth flow of the negotiation table, the magic, we always talk about this, the magic of the mediation room can never transfer to the cold and personal interaction that online dispute resolution offers. However, what we know is that post-pandemic, online mediation has remained very, very popular, even after the various restrictions melted away. So the most recent CEDAR audit found that around 2/3 of cases, commercial cases, were being conducted online, well after restrictions had lifted, as opposed to almost 90% in the midst of the pandemic, as you would expect. And there's been some other research from scholars, including James Claxton, recounting quite positive views of mediators regarding online mediation. So our research that I'm going to talk about here, and we conducted a number of interviews. We ultimately conducted 19 interviews. They were conducted appropriately, I guess, online, with a range of international commercial mediators from a number of jurisdictions, including here in England and Wales, Scotland, Ireland, France, Sweden, Switzerland, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, for example. And these were mediators who were, as far as we were concerned, were at the very higher echelons of practice. And we were specifically asking them about their experiences in cross-border international mediation, commercial mediation. So very high value international cases. And these were experienced individuals. Their practice ranged from 11 to 34 years. The majority, might not be that surprising, were male, and probably less surprising, almost all of them had a legal background as well. Maybe that's a seminar for a different day, perhaps, regarding lawyers and mediation. But we asked them about lots of issues, including, their views on barriers to growth, lawyers in the process, a bit about the Singapore Convention. But what I'll talk about today only, given the time constraints, are their experiences of and views on online mediation. So that's the focus today. So what was quite interesting that we found was that the majority of them had absolutely no experience pre-pandemic with online mediation, or very little experience with online mediation pre-pandemic. At the time of the interviews in 2022, all of them were involved in online mediation in their practice. And it was clear that many had moved from being quite skeptical of the benefits, the appropriateness of online mediation in their practice, to becoming, quite positive about the process. Many were actually quite glowing, had become converts, you might say, to the idea of online mediation. And a couple of quotes here which represented a lot of things that people were saying. 2 years ago, I would fight the idea of mediating online with every fiber of my being. I took the view it was an online process. But online mediation is remarkable. It works well. The facility on Zoom, ease of the breakout room, it's extraordinary, actually. So it works, no question about that. Another saying, my view sort of evolved. When the pandemic started, I was thinking, well, it's not going to be great to be online. Then I discovered it's not so bad. In fact, it's really good for some cases. And they were quite typical responses that we received from many of the mediators. This idea of this communications deficit, that you cannot replicate the nuances of in-person interaction online, it was still reflected by our interviewees. They still believed this to be an issue, but not as pronounced as they expected it would be. So one said, well, the last week I was mediating in person. It was an absolute joy. Yeah, I felt so much more was possible to engage with the parties. There was more of a sense of nuance, the kind of pause. Someone looks down, the quality of the process interaction is greater. Others were saying, yes, of course, you lose something, that personal rapport building, the little things noted in the room. Much harder to read the room. To read the non-verbal communication, you don't get the smell and the taste of things. Your senses are not engaged the same way. I'm missing the energy. I'm missing the body language. I see the facial body language, but I lose the other. I lose the feet. I lose the hands. And so, although they were saying that online mediation works a lot better than they expected, most were still decrying the lack of that nuance of interaction, that personal interaction that you get, being able to read the room better when you are in person. So there's still a marked difference, I think. But nonetheless, many expounded quite significant benefits of online mediation. And as you might expect, very obviously, and I think particularly in these very large, often multi-party and international high-value commercial mediations, which would typically involve, large teams traveling across the world in hotels and flights, costs and time efficiencies were very commonly reported. And many referenced their carbon footprint obligations. Many had signed the mediator's green pledge that perhaps many of you have also been a party to. But equally, there were other benefits as well. I mean, some mediators actually suggested that they believed their settlement rates were higher online than in person. There was more immediacy in terms of getting things organized more quickly. And they also said it was easier to get senior decision makers in the room online, which wasn't always the case with in-person mediation. They had to compromise sometimes about the people that they managed to get in the room. And some also talked about, and I've read this kind of commentary elsewhere, particularly regarding, say, family mediation or lower value civil disputes, that sometimes when emotions become heated, it may be easier to be online. People may feel more comfortable. They're not exposed to the other side. I think some people regard face-to-face as in your face. It can be more challenging, and the ability of the parties to be in the screen reduces it. And it's interesting for me that even in these very high-value, sophisticated commercial disputes, mediators were talking about the emotional challenges sometimes of being in person. What we also ascertained, and this came across quite clearly, is that the migration to online wasn't simply taking the process as we found it in person and putting it completely in the same way online. And in fact, it was leading to a process change much of the time as well. And we were seeing sort of hybrid approaches developing, and this might be something that you are very familiar with in your own practice. And certainly we found that many mediators were talking about how online mediation had led to enhanced pre-mediation activity. Even if the main event might still be in person, they were doing a lot more work at the pre-mediation phase online, particularly with the clients in a way that they were not doing prior to the pandemic. So a few representative quotes here. I think it's enabled much more contact with parties as opposed to only their advisors. I don't know why that is, because we could have had a conference call before the pandemic with parties, but that was less my practice. We now spend time not just with the lawyers, but also with the clients on Zoom before the mediation. Show them how it works so they don't get lost in the day, explore the merits of the case with them, start to challenge them, look for opportunities. So when it comes to mediation, you hit the ground running. It's a much richer experience. We never used to do this. We always had a quick call with the lawyers. In the actual in-person, once you've done the online pre-mediation element, you hit the ground running. Parties know you, you've got a connection, you build on that. So it's quite interesting that we're seeing these sort of hybrid approaches becoming much more dominant, and it certainly seems to have benefited the pre-mediation activities, certainly, whether or not the mediation itself still takes place in person or it is also online. But there were some concerns, some other deficits which were identified by mediators with the online variant of mediation. And I think this is one of the key ones, and I do think about this quite a lot. Just in any kind of interaction you're having, which becomes online, and they're saying there's none of this breaking bread or what they called water cooler conversations on the online environment. And I guess it's the lack of spontaneity, the things that happen in the room, the informal, off-the-cuff conversations that take place out with the formal setting of mediation. Because everything, of course, is scheduled and planned and organized online. So a few mediators talked about this. These are quite a good couple of quotes, I think. I do believe, though, that, especially in commercial mediation, breaking bread together, having a meal, these are things that can make a difference. Discussions when parties share cigarettes or have a coffee in between breaks are where a lot of the magic happens. The other issue is the inability to have what they call water cooler conversations, just to say, as a mediator, how's it going? What do you think? What do you think is going on here? I have a number of mediations where I kind of hover about, hoping to catch one person and just have a conversation without making a big thing about it, but knowing I need to speak to someone. So it's a kind of engineered, if you like, spontaneous conversation that as mediators you might want to have. But you can do it on Zoom, but you've got to be quite proactive and say, I need to pull a party. It's much more obvious. So that lack of spontaneity, which can lead to some of the breakthroughs, is certainly seen to be a concern by some of these mediators. The next issue was the matter of ethical issues with online mediation. And it's fair to say that the majority of mediators didn't discuss these. There's been quite a lot of writing, quite a lot of work in the literature about the lack of perhaps really well thought out codes of practice for dealing with the differences that one will face when mediating in the online environment, because we did shift to online mediation very quickly, rapidly, without a great deal of thought much of the time. But the mediators, most of them didn't discuss these issues. None of them had encountered issues with security or confidentiality. And these may be issues which are more relevant in less sophisticated environments where people are joining mediation on their phones from their living room. You don't know who else is in the room with them. Maybe the facilities are not particularly sophisticated. But nonetheless, a minority did reference ethical concerns and a lack of established frameworks for online mediation. So one example here, I've got one party WhatsApping me at the same time, telling me the background to what this other party is telling me in the joint session. And I personally think that's not on unless it's transparent. So somebody, and I'm sure you all use WhatsApp to communicate with parties in your online mediations, but someone telling you when the other party's speaking what this really means from their perspective. Another said, I think there's a big opportunity for institutions to really set out very thoughtful protocols about moving online. What does that mean? Some have started that process, but many aren't. You've got COVID online protocols, mediation protocols sort of popping up, but not with much thought. That's very risky. In terms of the future of online mediation, and when we spoke to these mediators, the vast majority envisaged in the future a mix of online and in-person mediation in their own practice. What was quite interesting was that a minority said that they were by and large giving up in-person mediation, and that they were offering only online mediation, or at least saying this is the default operation, and that we would only in exceptional cases offer up in-person mediation. Now, some of them said, well, because we're so well established and we've got a very well built up practice and reputation, we're in a privileged position of being able to dictate the terms. And if you don't want me, that's fine. You can go to somebody else. But of course, many others may be more dictated by what the market wants. What are clients, what are lawyers asking for in terms of a mediation offering? Only one of the mediators, this was a mediator from France who really hated with all every fiber of his being online mediation, said that he was giving up online mediation completely and would only offer mediation in person, but the vast majority had become very comfortable with it. Now, some of them did reference what they were seeing as a growing, this is in 2022, client and lawyer demand for a return to in-person mediation. Most viewed this need as fueled by ignorance, that these were people that hadn't really got much experience of online mediation, who didn't know that it might work pretty well. They also talked about shifting to shorter sessions to avoid Zoom fatigue. So getting away from the full sort of 8 in the morning till 2 in the morning, all day commercial mediation setting that they were used to, scheduling more, shorter, regular meetings. But most saw online mediation becoming an established part of international commercial matters. And also they saw it as a way to try and expedite growth in terms of bringing more parties into mediation more broadly by giving more flexible options, more cost-effective options, which might be attractive to parties. The other thing I'll say here is that we also detected perhaps, and this is something that's happening, I'm sure anyway, because a shift away from joint session into more caucusing, more private sessions, something which, as I'm sure many of you know, has become a very prominent aspect of the commercial market anyway, the demise of joint sessions. And this idea that perhaps the online setting, because of the ease of breakout rooms, because it's more difficult to manage, a joint session online where parties are speaking at the same time, that this may be leading to greater use of caucusing. And equally, I think that if caucusing is happening anyway, that may naturally move the session online, because if you're caucusing more often, you're not as reliant on that nuanced personal interaction that we might see in person in a joint session anyway, because that's not the style of mediation that you're using. So I think there's almost like a cause and effect issue here with caucusing and the use of online mediation. I'd be really interested to know some of your views on these kind of matters. So I want to just shift a little bit. I'm not going to talk for long on this issue, and then we can come into a conversation in the room that I'm certainly looking forward to. A bit about online mediation education. And one of the interviews in particular was very critical of what he saw as mediators trained inadequately online, as not being equipped for in-person mediation. And obviously, most of the professional bodies, such as the CMC, the International Mediation Institute, began to approve online mediation training in the pandemic out of necessity. And they've continued in that approval with certain conditions, of course, as regards to the practice of those individuals. And from my point of view, online mediation training providers has accelerated significantly. Lots of new operators in the field offering, I guess, cheaper than the traditional methods, online mediation training. And IMI and CMC are accrediting those trained completely online as mediators. And I want to just end this part of the session today by just saying a few things of my own reflections on online mediation from teaching at Newcastle. So we teach a program here, which is an online master's program. It's completely taught online. And within it is included International Mediation Institute accreditation as mediators as well within the master's program. And the way that we do it is a combination of what you might call asynchronous materials, which is basically online immersive video-based content that students will go through at their own pace, that's scheduled weekly for them, and they can then work through the materials, as well as scheduled classes, seminars and practice sessions, but done online over Zoom, just like this. And we have classes in conflict resolution, mediation, negotiation theory, a bit of law as well, international and national mediation law, online dispute resolution and technology, and also practical mediation skills as well. And students, at the end of their assessment for one of the classes, the mediation skills class, they do 2 online assessed role plays, externally assessed by an external mediation trainer for IMI purposes. And the students also conduct an in-person mediation that they have to film and send in as part of their accreditation. They write a reflective log on the differences of online and in-person mediation. Again, that's for International Mediation Institute purposes. And a few things that I've learned about online learning, and obviously for me, in the pandemic, obviously all of my teaching out of necessity migrated online over Zoom. And I hadn't really used Zoom much at all before the pandemic. I was familiar with things like Skype for meetings with international colleagues, for example, but I hadn't done any teaching at all online at that time. But it's been interesting for me as an experience, what I've gained from that over the years. I think in terms of online learning, although the ability to schedule classes in an asynchronous way, so have materials that students can work through at their own time, which clearly increases flexibility significantly. You still require to have live sessions where you bring people together It's essential for building community. Of course, there are scheduling issues where you've got delegate students from all over the world in different time zones. And of course, I think the one thing about online mediation training is that it's clearly replicating mediation practice now. As I said at the beginning, about 2/3 of all commercial mediation activity in the UK, according to the CEDAR audit at least, is taking place online. But our students are able to identify, and I think there is a significant difference between mediating online and mediating in person for some of the reasons we've talked about this morning. In terms of teaching and training, I think Zoom works incredibly well. It worked, again, for me, a lot better than I expected. We can have this form of engagement as we're having today and the discussion we'll have afterwards. It works incredibly well on Zoom, actually. And we also run discussion boards in our program to stimulate debate, to allow us to monitor our student engagement, sort of hold their feet to the fire. We know they're engaging. The other thing is this flexibility. I was talking before this morning when we were setting up about the ability to bring in people for these seminars, for example, from all over the world. That wouldn't be possible before when you're meeting in a pub in London, having a breakfast, as it were. So the benefits of online training and seminars are really, really apparent in that way. It's much more accessible. At the click of a button, you can bring in people from anywhere across the world, and that's great. So for our students here at Newcastle, they can much more easily practice online with others in the school, but also from other universities all across the world. And they quite often train with people from Hong Kong, Singapore, across Europe, and it's so easy to do now. You probably know there's been a lot of online mediation competitions as well, started up for students, which is brilliant, again, at spreading the word, getting people exposure to different jurisdictions, to different cultures. And I think it is possible to gain a real sense of community. Even if students never come together in person, when they meet online, they can really actually get to know each other pretty well. And I've had a number of students that I've never met in person, but I still feel that I know really well. You can really forge that sense of community online if it's done well. And the last thing, I just wanted to pose a few questions. I know we're going to go into a kind of discussion element now, and feel free to ask me questions first, of course. I've not looked in the chat yet. I'm sure there may be some, of course. But I'm interested in these questions as well here. Has the shift to online mediation really altered your mediation practice in any significant ways? Or if you've experienced it as a lawyer or participant, in your view, has the practice shifted significantly from in-person mediation? What about the experience of online mediation training? In your view, does it prepare mediators adequately for in-person mediation? Any other perceptions of online mediation education are welcome. And, I'm always interested in the future of mediation practice. And obviously, we're going through a period where online mediation has become very popular. And of course, the costs and convenience aspects of that are a real driver. It's a significant benefit, of course. But how do you see it developing from your point of view in your practice area in the future? Is there an increasing appetite for getting back to in-person mediation? So thank you very much. That's all I wanted to say in this aspect of it. I didn't want to speak for too long. I know this is a meeting. It's not really a seminar as such. I didn't want to speak at great length. But I'll stop sharing, and I'm quite happy to answer questions you have and to obviously discuss these issues with you in the session afterwards. So let me just stop sharing. I'm not sure if Dave is back on, Michael, if he managed to get back on.
Dave, are you there?
Yes, I am. Yes, sorry about the hiccup at the beginning.
Oh, that's right. You're there now. Okay, so does somebody want to make an observation, ask Brian a question? We've got one or two things in chat. Yeah, well, who wants to go first?
Could you raise your electronic hands?
Or even your
Burns wishes to speak.
Okay, Julian, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thanks very much. That was very interesting. I just wanted to ask a question about hybrid mediation. In my experience, one of the less positive developments of online mediation is the way that a lot of lawyers are setting up their online mediations by being in a room with their clients and beaming the mediator in remotely. So I find that a totally inferior process, and it takes a lot of setting up right and explaining that you need people to have multiple devices, making sure you haven't got the feedback. And even when you do all that, suddenly one of them will turn it off halfway through the day. You can't see everyone in the room. You don't feel like you're in the room. And that is something that I'm increasingly finding is almost becoming sort of the norm. When people book you for an online mediation, that's actually what they're booking. And so for me, remote mediation, online mediation works brilliantly if everyone is like this in front of a camera having a conversation. You feel like you're around the table. I'd just be really interested to sort of gather thoughts from you and everybody else as to how they're dealing with that, because I feel like I'm on the brink of sort of getting out there on LinkedIn and having a bit of a polite rant about it.
Yeah, I mean that definitely did come up, I think, absolutely. So it's online for you, but not for them in a sense. It's this hybrid setup. Yeah, certainly some mediators were talking about how in their experience, you needed to have very, very good equipment, very good technology. I think because these were mediators acting with very sophisticated clients at the very high end, that they tended to have probably better facilities. But I know that as an issue in many circumstances, actually. And I was speaking to one of my colleagues, well, you'll know Eileen Carroll pretty well, all of you, I'm sure. She was talking about exactly the same problem with me recently, saying that, you know, this doesn't work that well because you can't see who's in the room, and the technology doesn't work very well when they're in person all together and you're being beamed in. It doesn't tend to work. So I think absolutely that is an issue much of the time. I would agree with that.
A lot of the lawyers have invested in this sort of fancy owl sort of technology where it zooms in on the speaker, which they think is great, but it just isn't, because you get the wrong people and you can't see the reaction of the people next to them, and it highlights, zooms in on the lawyers and you lose the clients. And
yeah, I mean, we use the owl for hybrid meetings and it's not that great. I mean, you're right, and this is the best we've got at the moment at the university, clearly. So I think, given the technology is not fantastic, that's problematic, and that definitely did come out in the survey. Absolutely.
Okay, it's not just me then. Thank you.
Yeah.
Definitely not just you, Julia. If you're going to have a rant, let me know on LinkedIn when you're going to do it, and I will jump in right behind you. And
I've written something about it. It will be imminent. Yeah, maybe off the back of this, I'll post it in the next couple of days.
Yeah. What I have had that's worked really well, though, is when one of the lead decision makers has not been able to join the in-person, and we've had him as being the person on the big screen at the end of the room.
Yeah.
Just to make sure that it happened. And that I was slightly concerned as to whether we were going to keep him engaged. I'd been told a lot about what a character he was and this, that, and the other, and that I would struggle to manage him and so on and so forth. But actually it made the mediation possible and it worked absolutely fine. It's when we're the figure on the big screen at the end of the room that it's a nightmare.
Yep.
I think, Sally, you've got on my screen anyway, your hand up next.
Hi, thanks. And thanks very much, Brian. Very interesting. I just wondered if there's any research you're aware of what it's like from the client's point of view and if they have preferences.
Yeah, I mean, there has been some research about that, but not much. As you would expect, we tend to know what the professionals think in most of these areas before we know what the clients. It's partly about access as well. It's easier to speak to lawyers and mediators than the clients themselves. There was a bit of work done which suggested that clients, a very small piece of work, found the process to be, I think, more effective than they expected in advance. Certainly, there isn't, to my knowledge, any detailed work about that. We tend to know that there's been some work done on, you probably know about civil mediation claims by David Sixsmith, but again, that was about mediators. There's been some work on lawyers. But as far as we know, I mean, anecdotally, hearing from the mediators that the clients enjoy it, that they find it suitable and a good way to resolve the disputes. But you're right, there isn't a huge amount of work that I'm aware of yet, which is really drilled into the client view of this. And that sadly tends to be the area with much of this kind of research, actually.
Thank you. Roger Levitt, next, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Brian. That was really fascinating. I think I agree with absolutely every word, including the highlight for me was hitting the ground running, because in the pre-mediation Zoom preparations that I do, my briefing note actually uses those words, and it works. It works so well, and it's second nature now to all of us. I mean, the fact that we're all on this screen together is something that we don't even give a second thought to. But 5 years ago, as Julian and Carolyn will well remember, when we got together on the 17th of March, thinking, what do we do? How do we work this new technology? How do we decide which platform to use? And now it's just completely second nature. So I think, you know, we've all got used to working with it to our benefit. And one last comment, Julia, thank you for your comments about the way in which some firms use the big screen and sitting 15 meters away in the background. It's so irritating. And of course, once they've set up, there's nothing we can actually do. It just doesn't feel appropriate to say, can you all please change your seating arrangements and come close to the screen? But that's really what we want to do. There's no facial language, there's no body language, no nothing.
Yeah, and Roger, when you're doing that kind of mediation that way, is it pretty much all private sessions then? You're on the screen with one group of people who are not together, obviously, with the other group. Is that the way that it's working essentially?
Well, I think it's very much a hybrid in terms of how the online setup works, because some people make it clear even before you ask them that there's no way I'm going to sit in the same room or even on the same screen as those so and so, and so therefore you just put them in their breakout rooms and you shuttle from the start. But for other people, it actually it's a safe space to be online with other people, where, you know, for geographical reasons or whatever else, they wouldn't sit in the same room or even the same building.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at the comment that Anthony Sendel had made on the chat there about the demise of joint sessions, you know, and it's, you know, the practice becoming very, very much one of caucusing only. And I mean, I do share the view that is you know, I understand why it's happening, but I'm not convinced it's the best approach, absolutely. And it's become incredibly commonplace. I guess it's to some extent driven by lawyers. I mean, that would be sort of my view on it. But even, I mean, I do a student mediation competition. We're doing it in Belfast, actually, at the end of the month. These are undergraduate, postgraduate student teams. And, you know, I'm taking a team there, and I do judging there as well. It's amazing how many teams actually now, they immediately after the joint session, I mean, we make them start in joint session. They don't have a choice about that. They have to do opening statements. We just make them do that. But immediately the teams go into caucusing and just caucus, and come back to joint session if they agree something. And I mean, so many of the teams do that now, and that's the way they're being taught now. And it does concern me a bit that this has become the sort of dominant model without much thinking, I think, around it, because it suits the professional requirements of some individuals. But anyway, that's just a slide. And I wonder if online will exacerbate that, because it facilitates that kind of exchange. Absolutely.
I do share your concern as well, because I think the joint session as a safe space is often very helpful, very constructive. But also where there's high emotion involved, and people don't want to come together, then you have to respect that.
I understand that. Of course.
I was just going to say quickly, could somebody who's got a bit of noise in the background go on to mute, please, because we were getting interfered with. Okay, who's next?
Michael, just before we go on that point, Brian, from the comment you made about the student competitions, I think some of that is generated by the marking system, because they are told beforehand that you have to demonstrate these various points. So there's probably some kind of framework that they feel that they have to adhere to maximize their chance of getting points.
Well, I mean, in our one, just very quickly here, that they do have to caucus at least once. So they're told they need to show caucusing, but they're not in any way told that they need to just caucus all the time and not have joint sessions. So yeah, but I take the point, David. You know, some of them will have different rules, I'm sure.
Thank you. Graham, I think you're next. Are you with us, Graham? You're muted still. That should be clear now.
Right. Yes, I wanted to echo Sally's point about knowing the client's point of view. And I suppose it's somewhat more difficult to ascertain that scientifically. And we all have our own subjective views about it. Obviously, thank you very much, Brian, for contributing something that we tend to take for granted, which is the thought that somebody is actually doing objective research into things. Because I think it's very easy for any discipline to go off onto trajectories that everybody's confident about, but doesn't actually have any reason for objective reason.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly some. Sorry, Graham. I think there's certainly some evidence in, you know, sort of maybe things like community and neighbourhood mediation settings that, you know, parties do find the facility to be on screen valuable because they are, you know, generally afraid or very nervous or, you know, quite stressed, anxious about the prospect of being in the room with somebody else, and that it certainly helps to provide that barrier. So in that context, I think it can be really helpful, actually, for parties, and also the convenience of not having to travel and the rest of it for them. There's something about being in the comfort of your own home, and you can make a cup of tea, you're in your own kitchen or whatever, when you take a break. It's not like being in some neutral venue where, you know, I think those can be comforting things that can be helpful sometimes, absolutely.
Yes, to me, subjectively, that factor trumps almost everything else in my assessment of how clients react. The fact that they're sitting in their own comfortable chair, in their own familiar environment, as you say, they've made a cup of tea exactly how they like it. That gives a huge sense of comfort, which enables them to be in a more relaxed frame of mind. And I think relaxation is absolutely key to the settlement mentality. If you're tense, you tend to go defensive. The problem is the fatigue, that if you're doing a mediation that goes much over a day, I would think, you do really get very, very fatigued, and presumably the clients do as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, isn't it? I mean, certainly my practice in doing things virtually, both in mediation and arbitration, is to really run for not much more than an hour at a time before having a break, whatever you're doing. And that seems to work quite well. The other thing I was going to make is hitting the ground running. I agree with that, because if you're doing a virtual mediation, you're bound to have signed the mediation agreement before you start, and you don't face this slightly awkward going from room to saying hello and stuff like that. You know, you're straight into it, and in many ways, I think that makes the start of the mediation a lot more productive. And just one final observation about people not wanting to be in the same room. This was actually an arbitration where a sort of super high net worth individual falling out with his girlfriend. There was no way that they were going to be even in the same country. Yeah. So we had a I don't know, we had a week's hearing or something like that. We never knew with with the two parties, we didn't know where they were. They were on the screen, but we didn't know where they were physically, because the girlfriend didn't want the ex-boyfriend to know. So I mean, there's all sorts of advantages that way, and I really agree with just about everything you said, Brian.
Thank you. Jeremy Lawrence, I think you're next. Jeremy, I think you should declare a vested interest, because I think the background behind you says online.
All right.
Thank you very much, Dave. I'm Jeremy Lawrence. I am, my company is Mediation Works Online Limited, which gives a hint to some of the work that I am doing. I'm a first-time caller and first time in the group. Thank you very much for having me. Thanks, Brian, for the presentation. I am doing a lot of send mediations online, and that's the way they have to take place, really, because you've got the family often taking a moment off work to be able to participate in the mediation. The school's at school, the local authority rep is in their offices and moving from one mediation to the next. It's really important to be able to do that. I find a lot of the mediations where you're not looking to build up an ongoing relationship work really well online as well. You're just trying to get to the nub of an issue and help participants move on. My real interest that I want to declare is that during the pandemic until very recently, I was a congregational rabbi, and I had that through COVID. And it became immediately necessary during COVID to develop soft skills online to be able to handle the pastoral issues that people needed. And one of the things we've talked about, and Brian, you alluded to, was the need to be able to have the relationship with the participants. And we talked about the water cooler moment and all of that. And during COVID, we needed to be able to handle really difficult matters with great sensitivity, bereavement, impending bereavement. And I think that the online teaching and even the in-presence teaching of mediation isn't addressing some of the online soft skills that need to be there, and particularly how to set up your camera, who to look for in the room. My daughter Devora, who is just doing her A-level mocks at the moment, grew up in Zoom. She's much more comfortable meeting people online and actually finds being present with people itself confrontational. So there's partly a generational thing now. We look to online as being alienating, but for some people it's actually their preferred and more comfortable mode. And the final thing I want to say about OWL is, as an early adopter of OWL in education, in the sort of immediate post-pandemic era, we did lots of presentations and panels using OWL with social distancing. And the seasickness as it moves from one area to another was quite discombobulating. But also, as we put together the presentations to put online to people who hadn't been able to attend, the cinematographers with whom I worked found editing the OWL footage really bad because it was always slightly lagging and never quite capturing the right moment. And when I'm mediating in person, I'm sitting with a mess of screens in front of me like I am now. I'm able to look the people directly in the faces as they are, and the OWL swinging backwards and forward mediation works on the AI choice of focus rather than mine, and that's a negative on the soft skills. Thanks very much for this morning.
No, thanks very much, Jeremy. It's really interesting, the things you were saying there about the soft skills, developing that. And I guess because it happened so quickly, we all had to run into Zoom, we didn't really know how to make the best use of the technology. I think that's fair to say, and that we're going to have to learn a lot of new skills in that context. And I think one thing that came out of the discussion with the mediators was that, in their view, the technology was getting better. So it was improving. It had got better in their timeline of using it for online and hybrid mediations. And I guess we would expect it to continue to get better. And some of the things we're talking about with IELTS and that, I would imagine that's going to improve to a great extent as we go into the next few years.
Thank you. Rob Langley, I think you're next, please. You're muted still, Rob.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, firstly, for having me in the New Mediators Breakfast Club. I'm a newcomer to it, and what I've heard today has been very encouraging and interesting. It's quite a lonely job being a mediator. It's very much yourself. And to know, for example, that everybody else has stumbled on what I thought I'd uniquely stumbled on and is now doing pre-mediation Zoom meetings, it's really encouraging. And it means it's just encouraging that obviously we're all out there explaining the same things to our clients. I'm finding that there is a widespread reluctance now to do opening sessions. It used to be that people accepted it's just the done thing, you have an opening session, but a disappointingly high number of people used to say, solicitors, advocates I'm talking about, would say, oh, the other side knows the case. I don't really need to go over all of that. And I'd say, well, no, you need, this is your chance to actually talk to their clients direct. And it's also your chance to put down into a pithy sort of elevator pitch presentation briefly why you've got a good case and they should be listening to you, or why they've made a mistake and they shouldn't be defending. And you're throwing that away if you don't actually talk to them. And it's worse now. I've got lots of people saying, "Oh, my firm never does opening sessions." A big multi-office firm does lots of insurance. Said that to me on Friday afternoon. It was so disappointing. But I wanted to ask if people have this experience, in that I'm finding an increasing reluctance to take the time and the trouble to give me a position statement. And I actually find I have to almost beg people to give me some papers more than 24 or 48 hours before the mediation happens. At best, if I'm lucky, I'll get a set of the pleadings or a set of the correspondence. But the days when people would give the same thought and care to briefing the mediator as they would to, say, instructing counsel or an expert on an important matter, I think they're gone. And I'm wondering, is it just me, or are other people having the same sort of problem with pre-mediation preparation and briefing papers?
Anybody with a general comment for that? Yes, Graham. You're muted.
I find that factor, I'm very interested that Rob raises that. It's an irritating thing. But the thing I notice is that there's often a huge asymmetry between the parties. One side will be full of enthusiasm. They'll give you more than you've asked for.
Mm.
The other side grudgingly give you about 50% of what you've asked for.
Yeah.
I don't know any rhyme or reason for that, but that's what I've been finding relatively recently.
What we're going to have to do, it seems to me, is to actually really get onto the front foot. And I'm learning to be much more proactive, scheduling to phone people, a fortnight beforehand. Can I have something? Yes, you can. A week beforehand, I haven't had it. Where is it? What can you do in the meantime? And I usually find myself saying, look, don't bother with the position statement. Let me know what the costs are and send me the papers you think are important. I'll find out for myself by reading. But I think one of my lessons going forward is to just be as proactive as I can in coaxing the briefing documents out of often very busy, harassed solicitors who are prioritizing everything else except for that mediation. They'll deal with that when it comes along, which is probably the morning of the mediation they start thinking about it.
Yes, it worries me slightly that because of that asymmetry, you find yourself talking to one side much more than the other.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And
Rob,
you obviously have to be careful.
You said, I do what you do, go on the front foot and try and encourage everybody to get what you need ASAP, and the pre-mediation stuff I do on Zoom as well. But I think what you raise is probably a more important element, which is the lawyers are thinking as lawyers and they're not thinking as mediators.
Yes.
And I know there's a big drive now on what is known as mediation advocacy to try and get the lawyers, solicitors or barristers to think as a mediator and to understand the point of mediation. And those of you who are on this call regularly, and Dave, you'll have heard me say this before, I did a property mediation about 6 months ago, and I went for a site visit and I got them all there, which was great because they all got to meet each other and talk about the shopping centre in question. But one of the litigators pulled me aside afterwards and said, "You do know, Gerard, this is litigation." And I said, "I know you're doing litigation. We're doing mediation." And I had to explain to her that the golden nuggets, all the emotional stuff, the psychology stuff. And I find that when you, in the pre-mediation stage, when you make the lawyers aware that this is all about their clients and their needs and interests, and their client is also my client, and we should both together be thinking about their needs and interests, I find that smooths the path to getting a position statement, which I know we don't want to call position statements anymore because that's kind of litigious.
I noticed that.
Sorry, I need to finish. Just focusing on the actual needs of the participant, particularly the emotional and psychological bit.
I noticed that Roger smiled at the beginning of this of the last comment because he and I have both been on a 2-day conference, and this exact point will be the subject of the next speaker in March. So I'll mention that a bit later. Brian, have you got any?
Hang on, Dave. Sorry, we've got somebody talking in the background. Could you mute, please? Hello? Can you mute, please, whoever you are? Thank you. Okay, Dave, carry on.
Yeah, sorry.
Apologies, it's me, because I'm just about to go back into the third day of the mediation advocacy course.
Oh, that's okay.
I don't know if Dave is going to join us for the third day, but
no, I'm not, Roger. I'm going to have a rest.
Yeah, but if we could give a little shout out, but not just for the course, but for the fact that if more people were trained in mediation advocacy, we would have much more of a collaborative and cooperative approach.
Yeah, well, Andrew Goodman's going to be our speaker in March on this exact point.
Yeah.
Brian, I'm just wondering, have you got any specific comment on what's been said on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think just going back to the first topic that Rob mentioned about the sense that parties or lawyers are dispensing with joint sessions. At the beginning, I think it's a really worrying aspect of it, because I mean, lawyers. I mean, if you might remember, lawyers have been historically very resistant to mediation as a first response for different reasons. Have kind of blocked it in different measures, and we look back in the last 20 years, that's been the case. But they tend to move from a position of resistance to accommodation, and then ultimately to capturing the process and trying to influence it in a way that suits their own professional norms. I think that's happening, and has happened for many years in some jurisdictions, where it becomes more of an evaluative process. It becomes less about joint sessions, about communication, about problem solving, and more just about, transactional negotiating in joint sessions because it suits them. And not having joint sessions will suit them because they don't have to organize that, don't have to speak. They just get their clients in the room. They're quite comfortable in that environment without the other parties there, you shuttling back and forth. And I think that is a worrying concern for me. And it's definitely a trend that I've detected more recently in this country and elsewhere in commercial civil mediation. And there was a comment here about, I can't remember who put it, but Alice actually had said, who's in charge of this process here? I have to remind the lawyers that this is my process, I'm the mediator. So to what extent can we as mediators say, look, if you're signing up for mediation, the product's not negotiable. This is what we're doing. I'm in charge here, I'm the expert, you're working with me to help your clients get the best possible resolution. In my professional opinion, we need to have a joint session. Now, I know that might not be practical some of the times in terms of the way you negotiate with lawyers to get cases, but that's what we should be doing, I think, and saying, look, we're the master of the process here. You guys are masters of the substance and the outcome, but I'm going to run the process because I'm the expert here in this, and having a joint session at the beginning, in my view, will be the best way to kick this thing off for the reasons that we've heard. I mean, Camilla, you've had your hand up for a while, and I'm not sure. I feel a little bit bad that I spoke there before you, but
Oh, can I come in very briefly? I
Yes,
mean, obviously, every mediation is very different, and I do a lot of judicial mediations in the employment tribunal, where you have really sort of inequality of arms, generally litigants in person, and lawyers, sometimes 3 or 4 on the other side. So I try and move away from the law and move towards the psychology, if you can call it that. Because I do think that
Roger, we're still sorry to interrupt. Roger, I think we're still getting your background noise. If you can mute, please, Roger. Sorry, Camilla.
And being online is a bit of an equalizer. I may be, I'm the employment judge being a judicial mediator, but I'm sitting at my kitchen table or my office as everyone else is. And it is much more informal and flexible. And it certainly does work. So the other thing I'd just say is sometimes you do have to talk more to one side than the other, particularly if you have someone who's not represented. And with a joint meeting at the beginning, the problem is often someone who is not representative feels, at a disadvantage faced by a table full of lawyers. So I think, if there is going to be an opening session, it should be about, we're here to try and resolve it, not talking about the rights and wrongs of the case, because in mediation, that is not what happens. And I think that's probably the same in workplace mediations as well. So I just think that every single mediation is different, and you have to be totally flexible as to what is the right way for the parties, both parties.
Do you want to come back on that, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I have spoken to some mediators who were saying that they're dispensing with opening statements because they felt it would set things up adversarially if each side was to entrench their positions in that way. So I have heard that as well. And you're right, I guess it has to be a flexible process. There may be times, of course, where it's just not appropriate to have people together. I understand that. And where, it might be better just to start with parties in separate rooms. What I was saying is that I just think there's a lawyer-driven move towards that, which isn't necessarily appropriate in a general sense. And that as mediators, we should be in a position to make the call on those aspects and think, well, what's the best way of proceeding here, and to advise in that respect, and not be kind of railroaded by lawyers into this is how we want to practice. This idea that this firm never has joint sessions. Well, why is it the firm's decision? It should surely be the professionals in their view as to how they want to run that. That's why we're here, because you've got the expertise to help the parties resolve the matter when they haven't been able to do so otherwise. So yeah, that's what I say about that. But I do agree, Camille, that it has to be flexible, absolutely, and horses for courses, different approaches suit in different environments, absolutely.
I think we've got time for one other comment or question. Carl Thompson, you've just put your hand up, so you're the last but not leastly, as usual.
Yes, sorry, can everyone hear?
Yes, we can, Carl.
Yes, welcome. Hello, everyone. I've been listening very interestingly to Brian's very interesting talk about online. It's really been a great session, and thank you, Brian, and thanks for all the comments that I've heard. The four words that I can think of as to why online will probably not now be shifted. It's like you've let the horse out of the stable. You'll never be able to contain it. Are convenience, cost, expediency, and time, and pretend ecology, such as all the green profits. I mean, first of all, some years ago, there was a chap called Professor Ethan Cash, I think it was, who did a very interesting talk for the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators, which was very compelling. And I remember being there at the time thinking, well, the world's changed because we're not going to be able to go back. Now, I think the problem is the balancing thing that I've been thinking about in my own thoughts is how do we control or manage the process in the light of technological advances. We are just sort of getting into Zoom and video conferencing, etc. I'm looking at it from a technological point of view now. We're just getting into that. But the problem is we've now got artificial intelligence. I mean, artificial intelligence has been around for quite a while, but as these things tend to develop, as soon as we start to get familiar with what we've got now, we've got AI hitting us. And then the possibility of AI sentience, basically what is meant by that is an AI process that can actually reason like a human. And how will this impact on the mediation process? Before the pandemic and Zoom, etc., a lot of people were resistant to the idea of online. In fact, they just didn't think about it. Some techno geeks, like some of us, we thought, yeah, it's going to go that way. Teaching online has been going on for quite a while. Leading universities have been doing it. Some have resisted, but everyone's now thrown the towel in and they're going along because of the massive technological influence. And the question is, how does this fit for mediators who are soft skills people, who believe in the magic of mediation, such as various people, leading mediators like to talk about the magic of mediation, and what does that mean precisely? And the psycho mediation school, who believe in using psychology rather than just process. And a very interesting comment by Camilla on ditching the litigious side and moving to the psychology, which I was hearing. I mean, the main thing is, I think this needs a lot of research, and I think that's good for academics. Just ask one question: what research is planned in relation to artificial intelligence and how that might impact the role of the mediator online?
I'm not sure if that's a question for me. Maybe you're asking me that, Carl. I think that, I mean, it's not an area that I'm working in currently myself, but I know that a lot of colleagues are looking at this. There's an Italian mediator, what's his name, Giuseppe, I can't remember his second name, who's been running sort of AI mediation training for some time.
Yeah.
I can try and send on a link to him if anyone would like. I'll find out more about that. And I know it's being used in training, AI helping construct questions, construct scenarios, for example. There's been a lot of discussion about AI judging, of course, in terms of the extent to which some of the aspects of judicial role can be sort of delegated down to AIs to draw the relevant law, for example, to to give solutions to problems. And there is some research ongoing with regard to AI and the extent to which AI can replicate the nuances of mediator interaction, which I think is actually more complex in judging, actually, given the things that we have to do as mediators. But there is some work going on, Carol, absolutely. I don't have the specifics here, but I could certainly have a look and pass some of that on if that would be useful for people. Because you're right, it will be absolutely the next thing, which is going to dominate the field, definitely.
Thank you for that. I'm also interested in it for the all-party working group on alternative dispute resolution.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. Michael, I don't know if you've got anything you want to say before we move on to housekeeping matters. You're muted, Michael.
Thanks, Dave. Sorry about that. Just fell into my own trap. Really, just to say on behalf of everybody, thank you so much to Brian. You managed to hold 54 people. Now, I didn't see how many people we had on the start, but that was, I think
we had 65 at one point.
Well, that was a good score. I think we had 85 books and 65 on, and we held 54 to at the end. So that's really good. Some interesting stuff on the chat, and also the flow of Q&A and comments and stuff. So really, really, really interesting and forward-looking stuff. So that's great. So Dave, over to you for housekeeping. Any newbies who want to introduce themselves in the next meeting and so on. Thank you.
I'd like to endorse what Michael's just said as well. And I saw at least one person clapping in real time. So only really two things. One is, I've mentioned the next meeting. So it's going to be on Wednesday, the 19th of March. I'll send out a save the date email about that. And as I said, Andrew Goodman, who has spoken to us before, will be our speaker, but he will be speaking on representing parties in mediation. So that picked up the comment that at least one person made.